Hello there, and welcome to episode 61 of Right Where You're Sitting Now. Joining me, I always seem to forget to bring you in early, but joining me once again, it's Marck with a C, Satyr. How are you doing, sir?
Very good, thank you.
And that was a very brief introduction there. I usually expect a more long, grandiose.
It's coming, don't worry.
Oh, okay, right, okay, excellent.
Brace yourself.
Now, one thing I wanted to address quickly is on the last episode with Tobias Churton, we ran a competition, but we didn't actually run it until the very end. And I know some of you sons of bitches out there don't listen to the end of the podcast after the interview ends, so we're going to restate it here. We have an extra copy of his book, Aleister Crowley in England, sent to us by the wonderful people at Inner Traditions, and we're going to be giving that away to one lucky listener. Now, the competition details are on the site at sittingnow.co.uk, but essentially all you have to do is follow us on Instagram and then comment with your Instagram name on the post on sittingnow.co.uk for the episode and answer the question that is posed in the post. You'll see it. There's a big picture of his book, and underneath that you'll see the question. It's not the most taxing of competition questions of all time, but it's more an exercise in engaging our audience. But anyway, so who are we talking to this week, Mr. Satyr?
It's Mr. Mark Stavish, and we're going to be focusing on his book, which I know it's been very popular, so hopefully many people will be familiar with it, and if they're not familiar with it, they will become more familiar with some of its concepts and ideas, and that's Egregores, the occult entities that watch over human destiny.
It's a really good book, isn't it? And we both read it. I think I've read it twice. You've read it twice. Yeah, it's very interesting. Quite a unique concept as well. You don't often see egregores brought up. I mean, as I say in the interview, the only other time I've really seen it in depthly brought up is in the Stephen Flowers book, The Fraternitas Saturni. Have you come across it before?
I've come across the concept. Yeah, I mean, it's the only book that's invested itself in shining a focused attention to that idea. It's sort of a spotlight on the idea of the egregore, and yes, I mean, so the word egregore is a Greek word. Originally was an order of angels, or angelic, sort of spiritual beings, angelic beings. Familiar from the pages of the Book of Enoch, if some people might be familiar with that. And then there's also like Solomonic Grimoire, the Sworn book. They feature quite vividly in that. So we're focusing on something. So we're going to be engaging in some thinking about magic. Let's let our very discerning audience decide if we're guilty of magical thinking or thinking about magic, but I'll let them decide that.
And let's roll to that interview now. Hello, Mark Stavish. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today. I was wondering if you could give us a brief biography of yourself, please.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. I am the founder, director of studies of the Institute for Hermetic Studies. We've been around for about almost 25 years, and we have courses on Teachable, and we have probably 30 or so books in production and publication. There's so many I lose track. And it's about traditional Western esotericism. And I've been doing this for quite a while. I have been involved in a variety of esoteric groups and movements, and so have some members of my family, my great uncle in particular, who I used to regularly attend different meetings with for quite a while. So I have a wide-ranging and deep background in various esoteric topics, and more importantly, practices, and what those practices do to us, how they affect us, how they change us, how we change ourselves with them, and what the strengths and weaknesses of that can be, because it's not all good, or at least not at the time. So that's one of my areas of focus is kind of the pathology of spiritual practice, where things go wrong. As I said years ago at a conference, a funny thing happened on the way to Tifereth, and how it's easy to get derailed on the journey. So that's me.
So I'm always interested in people's kind of origin stories, as it were, with what drew them to esoteric spirituality. So obviously you had a family connection, but was that what drew you in? Or
Well, I guess so. I mean, it's hard to say. When you're reading this stuff at 12, 13, 14, it's hard to say, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
so with the Institute of Hermetic Studies, I'm kind of interested in that. Could you talk a bit more about like kind of cause I saw somewhere that you do work with people in prison and all sorts.
Well, we don't necessarily work with them. What we have is a prison outreach program where if incarcerated men or women write to us asking for literature, we have a set aside amount of money that has been given to us specifically for that purpose, and we'll send them some of our publications, some of our monographs, and it's been working out well. I mean, it's interesting when some of your most dedicated practitioners are incarcerated. And we have, some other programs too. We've done library donations and institutional donations. We've taken care of that. And we do our primary fundraising is through Direct Ask and our annual conference, which is coming up in May of this year. And it is virtual as well. We don't like doing it virtually, but if we have to, we will. The show must go on, and it will go on indeed. And we have coursework that is open to really anyone. We have at teachable.com, the Institute for Hermetic Studies, we have a 6-hour free course to anyone who wants to take it called Unfolding the Rose. And it's an introduction to Western esotericism in general and our approach to the coursework in particular.
So is it like a kind of practically driven course, or is it like are there rituals or things involved, or?
Well, there's meditations and practices, but we're very practice oriented, very practically oriented. We look at this in terms of theory and practice. So there's some wonderful literature out there. There's wonderful videos if people want a academic understanding, and we supply them. We share links to those with people, regularly in emails because it's important. However, the only thing that's going to help you in your personal life, in your personal experience, is your practice. So everyone who is sincere about their journey needs to, take stock of their practice and what they expect from it, what they need to do, and, is it delivering as promised? And that kind of is the lead into why I wrote the book Egregores. I didn't really mean to. It was just I was talking to Jocelyn Godwin one day. We were out having lunch in Binghamton, and I said, I was thinking of writing a monograph on the topic. And he said, well, thank God, because if you don't, I'll have to. And I went home that night, and I had notes started, and I just started writing it. And it was really very conversational. If you've read the book, I'm sure you have. It's just a conversational style, and it describes this topic that we heard quite a bit about. We heard the word. It was like name dropping. Like an occult version of name dropping, but people often didn't really know what it meant, or they had an idea of what it meant, but the broader implications were never fully elaborated upon. So I just said, well, I'll write the book. And it's an interesting book because when it was done, as I said, I just sat down and wrote it. I wrote it conversationally. There's no chapters. I mean, it has chapters, but it's not like I put them in there. We put those in there after the fact. We said, oh, well, this looks like a good place for a chapter break, and this one does too. Yeah, that one's good. Okay. we thought about making it bigger, more examples, more information, but I said, no, it's like baby bear's porridge. It's just right.
Mm.
Let's not break it,
Yeah, and it's a very readable book. I mean, it sort of goes along. I found it very. It seemed to be. I seemed to read it very rapidly, and one of the things that really struck me about it is there are many spokes to the sort of the will, the hub of the egregore idea. As I was going through, the subjects that I had some familiarity with, and some which were completely unexpected. From Buddhism to sort of Lovecraft and a whole and the Rosicrucian thing, of course. There was a whole. It was difficult. I couldn't predict what was going to be on the next chapter, and it was fascinating how the sort of the concept of the egregore sort of underpinned the approach to all those subjects.
Well, when I wrote it, I couldn't predict what was going to be on the next chapter either. That's the beauty of it. It was just a conversation, and it's just meant to inform the reader. And some people have challenged some of the points made in there, and my response is, accept it or reject it. It's up to you. I'm not here to defend it. When people write to me probably weekly, monthly, I get emails or letters from people saying how the book changed their lives. And it has, because they didn't have a word for the experience. Now we do. In the last 2 or 3 weeks, the word has come into the popular vocabulary of mass formation psychosis. And that very aptly describes, although I wouldn't necessarily call every egregore a psychosis, but the process of its formation is like that of a egregore. It's very similar. They really, for practical purposes, identical. And I'll let other people tease that apart all they want. But the reality is, people who are practicing this stuff, whether for good or ill, for your best interest or not your best interest, aren't concerned about the finer points. It's just a matter of what works. Does this work? And in some respects, it's like what John Wanamaker said about advertising. Half of all my advertising dollars are wasted. I just wish I knew which half. But that's kind of getting ahead of ourselves to some degree.
Yeah, so to you specifically, what does an egregore mean? How do you personally define an egregore?
Well, I think Jacques Vallée gave a great example when he talked about the UFO phenomena being a social control mechanism, and that's really what an egregore is. It's a social control mechanism, and it does that in 2 ways. One is there's the aspect of a collective unconscious, in which people are part of the unconscious rules and aspects of a group. Okay. And then there's the additional aspect, which may or may not be part of someone's view, and they're free to accept or reject it, is the more metaphysical view, in which that is then further connected through the psychic dimensions to a variety of entities or sentient beings that may or may not be human. So we have this notion of gods and angels and demigods and demons and super beings like unknown superiors and all that kind of stuff, spiritual beings. So where do they fit in? So classically, the relationship was like a funnel. There's this small point of the funnel. Yeah, I think the small point. You can reverse the image if you want. Maybe it works both ways. And down here on terra firma, which is us. And then there's the big end of the funnel, which is maybe your deity of choice. So today is Thursday. The god which rules Thursday is the planet, Jupiter, Zeus. Any gods having to deal with Jupiter rule this day. The archangel Zadkiel rules this day. Other angels are associated with it, such as Cassiel. Okay, so all of these things fall into the egregore, the collective archetypal qualities, but they're not. When we speak of archetypes, people like to think of them as symbols. And in the Western mind, when we say a symbol, we mean, oh yeah, it's that. It's not real. Symbol means not real. A vague representation of something, but it's not the thing itself. In metaphysical world, the symbol is the thing. The symbol conveys qualities and powers and aspects because it is those qualities and aspects embodied to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of fascinated when reading the concept of the egregore, how that related to archetypes, because you've got within the archetypal idea, you've got the actual, and then you got the symbolic, but then there's something beyond that in the classical Jungian understanding, that there's something beyond that, which remains sort of on the other side of the veil, so to speak. And how do is the egregore the same idea as an archetype, or is it we're in the same territory, aren't we, essentially?
You're right, you are in the same territory, and that's where it gets messy, because an egregore is always collective. So you relate to something collective, but you may do it consciously, you may do it unconsciously. But really, when we're talking about egregores, we're talking about something like a family egregore, a political egregore, a religious egregore, an occult group egregore, even the social framework of your school PTA, or the council board for where you live. All of these things have a kind of certain leveling effect on people. A commonality of values often comes out. I see it on board of directors all the time. Really, especially if it's a nonprofit, really smart, successful people suddenly become stupid, when they're on a nonprofit board. It's interesting. So you see this primarily again in political and religious structures, because it's human idealism that they access, and that's where the problems begin, because they're offering solutions to human problems, which if they can offer and they solve those problems, that's wonderful, but often they can't. And that's where a lot of the book focuses on really just taking good stock of what are the organizations you're involved with and why. And primarily I focus on religious, philosophical, political, esoteric, because those are the ones that have the deepest emotional connection for people. And so, it's very simple. Are you getting what you were promised? And if not, why not? Can you get it? And probably if you can't, then how do you leave?
I mean, one of the things that struck me about it, with the concept of the egregores, is it possible not to be in an egregore of one shape or another, or many? I think we're probably in quite a few. I mean, anyone, for example, born in the Western world, where we're all Western Hemisphere, we're all inheritors, if we are conscious of it or not, of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and so on. That's in our cultural DNA. I mean, that's just a very broad example, but it does influence, it does colour and flavour our perspectives, our beliefs and values, our language, our day-to-day sort of communication. So it's there. It's something we live. It's something within which we live and move and have our being, if we're conscious of it or not, like fish swimming through the ocean. And is it sustaining us, or is it sort of hampering us, or sort of taking us in directions which, as you say, is not in our best interest sometimes?
Well, I mean, we see a lot of work going on today to destroy the Western connection to the Renaissance egregore, or even to the Enlightenment one, and to manipulate that one in a different direction. Because egregores are living beings. They're self-aware in some regards. And they feed off the devotion and the commitment of their members. And that's how they receive their life force, their sustenance. So, egregores of nations, of companies, of esoteric groups, they often can engage in a variety of forms of, we'll call it psychic conflict or war in the heavens with one another. And it can just be as simple as a little bit of irritation, like sandpaper. Like maybe when you were in high school and you had that weird rivalry with some other school, on their sports team, and you weren't even on the sports team. You didn't really care, but somehow, you knew that kids who went to that other school, you weren't supposed to talk to them, that kind of weird, kind of unconscious effect. Other times it's more specific. So egregores are nearly impossible to not be in because we are part of groups. What we can do is we can be very selective in the groups that we associate with. And the reason being is, we will become like the 5 people we spend the most time with.
Yeah.
So when we look at the teachings of, in classical Buddhism, it's the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, the teacher, the teachings, and the community of the practitioners. We have to look at that. Like in Freemasonry, which I wrote a book on, which I think we'll be talking about in a month or so. There's the Master of the Lodge. There is the Book of the Law, the volume of the Sacred Law, and then there's the Household of the Faithful, the Brethren. And you have to be really careful who you let into a lodge. It's like, because once in, they're hard to get out.
Yeah.
It's like ideas in your head. Once in, they can be very difficult to get out. It's like that earworm of music we joke about so much. I had a friend who worked at a place, and he would kind of walk down the aisle, of where all the cubes were when he'd go from office to office, and he'd kind of whistle that song from, what is it, from The Wizard of Oz, If I Only Had a Brain, And of course, on the way back, there'd always be someone humming it, and, that's the power of suggestion. You do this on purpose. And that's where we really have to look at who do we hang out with.
Exactly. I was really struck by the comments about the Freemasonry and fraternal organizations. Usually credible ones have a sponsorship system, and it's a form. I mean, there's lots of reasons for that, and one of the reasons is it's a form of sort of psychic hygiene in a way. It's a sort of there's a number of different reasons, and when that's ignored or overrun or it's not kept to, that can have kind of very destructive effects.
Sure, we call it guard ye well the Western Gate, and you guard well that Western Gate, who you let into your lodge, regardless of, especially if it's a metaphysical lodge. And, there are ways around that. Like you can have an open door policy in some point, but then there has to be a way of weeding people out. And, some ways are better than others. But then again, within the organization, you want to make sure that that weeding purpose is useful and practical, that it benefits you. It's not just a way of finding out, well, you're among the most devoted. You're the true believer. You're really part of the in crowd. That's where that process becomes pathological and is actually working against someone. You need the weeding process to be beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, how the sponsorship system is applied depends upon the dominant culture, and the dominant culture depends upon the people who are responsible in the upper echelons for sort of guiding that and supporting that. I mean, there's other reasons. I mean, when you sponsor somebody as well, also you're supporting them. You're literally, you're nurturing them. You're guiding them to some extent. You're taking on a responsibility, responsibility, but it relates to their responsibility as well, of course.
Mm-hmm. Very definitely.
Yeah. So, I mean, getting back to more, I guess, specific egregores. The first time I encountered the term was with the German Fraternitas Saturni. I'm wondering if you're aware of that particular group, and obviously the image you often see associated with that group is a bust of an egregore, someone one rendered into physical form. I was just wondering, had you, because I found that quite fascinating, that particular egregore. I was wondering if you had you'd encountered that.
Yes, I mean, I of course I read Stephen Flower's book, Dr. Flower's book. I read it. I found it very interesting. I read it back in the 90s when it first came out. And I've spoken with two members of the organization over the years. And, their emphasis on their egregore is where, of course, their notion of a collective power that comes from that. Remember, egregores are group; they're collective entities, and that which I cannot do by myself, we can do it together. Yeah, that's kind of the mantra of it. It's like the symbol of Italian fascism, and well, it's a symbol of other things as well. But that bundle of reeds, that bundle of arrows, one reed breaks easily, but you bind them together, and they're very strong. So it's the same way with us. Many hands lighten the load. So it's not new there, but it's specifically directed along psychic lines and towards a specific psychic manifestation. So for whatever reason, the members of that organization have found a certain affinity towards their understanding and their expression of this Saturnine current, and it comes through in very graphic form. And again, the notion of what is the entity or entities at the other end of that funnel.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. And I can't say anything more than that. I mean, my feelings towards that organization in particular are somewhat neutral. Because I don't know enough about it. I only know what I read in the book.
Yeah, same. They're fairly obscure, aren't they? In a way. I was kind of interested though. Is it common in your research? Did you come across other examples of kind of egregores rendered into some form? Where a group has acknowledged a kind of a form of an egregore and.
Generally speaking, they all are, whether they recognize it or not. I mean, even the form can be symbolic. So your logo is the expression of your egregore. So when you have the Ronald McDonald and Golden Arches of McDonald's chain, that's the expression of their corporate image, their corporate being, their corporate essence. The same thing with political parties. When you see the animal of the party, here would be, donkey or the elephant of the Democrats or Republicans. Those are, or whatever other party it happens to be. That is an expression of the egregore in physical form. And those are important because it's easier in religious or esoteric systems because you have so many expressions of Jesus, right? The human expression of Jesus throughout Christianity. You have all these images and statues which of different meditational deities, yogic masters, tantric adepts within Vajrayana Buddhism. You see the same in Taoism or in India, in Indian regular practices, not necessarily tantric practices, but regular Vedic practices as well. So this notion of creating something which I as a human being can begin to identify with is very important, the ability to identify. And that's where everything hinges on the I am statement. I remember my great uncle telling the story, he was a hypnotist as well. He said, Moses saw the burning bush, and the burning bush, he said, well, who are you? And he hears back, I am that I am. And he's thinking, I'm sure that really that cleared things up a lot. But the reality in our lives is when we say I am and then we fill in the blank. See, I am that I am, or it's really I am that which is becoming. But that is an expression of self-revelation, self-expression, self-knowledge, self-being. What people tend to do is they add something into that, I'm a Capricorn. No, you're not. You're just born in that sign. You're not a Capricorn, but you think you are. That's good. Or I'm this or I'm that. And that identification can be healthy or unhealthy depending on what its effect is on a person. And it can also be healthy or unhealthy for then a society as a whole too. And there can be tremendous denial of reality in those affirmations of beingness, which may or may not be important on the individual level, but can be catastrophic on the social level.
Yeah. I mean, in the monocultural groups, the psychology of that, it must have a far more tighter grip, especially if they're very introverted and I mean, some groups particularly sort of cut themselves off from the rest of the world, or even all the influence of the rest of the world, and are inward looking, introverted in that sense, psychologically introverted.
Or they seek to expand their influence over it, to absorb it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and there is the issue too. What is when you deny physical and material reality? There's an egregore at work. There's some kind of psychological function. There's a social control mechanism at work.
Yeah. I mean, another point I was going to bring up, something else I'd learned about recently, was this idea of the tulpa and how the tulpa is connected to the egregore. And the first time I ever heard the phrase tulpa was on Twin Peaks, of all things. And the most recent series, they're kind of represented as these kind of doubles, these sort of, I don't know what you call them really. They're kind of like an evil version or a dark shadow version of one, of a character within the story.
And sounds more like a doppelganger.
Yeah. I just wonder if that was, maybe they just used the word and didn't really grasp its meaning. But yeah, I found it fascinating in your book where you sort of dove into the kind of the history a bit of the tulpa. I was wondering if you could speak to the tulpa a little bit, because I think it's very fascinating.
And that's something some people often disagree with that. And I have to say, look, Alexandra David Neal was there. She was in Tibet. Okay, she was in Nepal, she was in Bhutan, she was in China during this period, and her recollections are written in a style that is typical of the traveler. That is, she cleans up the conversation so that it's readable to her reader. I'm sure that the discussion that she had regarding the tulpa didn't flow exactly as easily as it appears in her writing. And I just find it interesting that for decades she was one of the go-to places for reading, and still is. And other folks who've been at that time frame in the 20s and 30s and into the 40s who were in that area, we see a lot of folks now trying to dismiss them. We see a lot of powerful revisionism in all areas of esotericism, and trying to really get rid of anything that is simply either unpleasant or politically incorrect, or we simply disagree with. So with her, many people say, well, the notion of the tulku, is a energetic projection where the mind controls the expression of the body. Magical projection is kind of what it's wrapped around, that whole idea. And that is a willful incarnation, where an individual of skillful enough mental status is capable of directing their incarnation. This is not as difficult as many would have you believe, but it's rare. It's not often done as often as maybe people need to. So this tulku system is not universally accepted within Tibet, and it creates a lot of problems. But with it was the notion that a high-ranking individual could reincarnate. Their incarnation would be recognized. Probably the most famous example of that is of the Dalai Lama. And that with that would come a variety of benefits. Those benefits would be the students, the wealth, the whole hierarchy, the whole inheritance, really, of what that person previously had. So there's a complex culture behind the notion of this magical projection. Now, this magical projection doesn't necessarily have to be, because it's related to this idea of, again, magical projection of energy creation, is the tulpa, where you create a thing, a thought form, essentially. And we deal with this all the time in Western practices and beliefs. And the thought form can solidify to the point where it is visible to others, as the theory goes. And if you're not careful, and this is where it gets interesting, because then the whole question is, what is sentience? What is being? it can appear to take on a life of its own.
Yeah, and that narrative, that's very closely related to the idea of the cataclysmic idea of the golem, the Talmudic idea of the golem, and of forming a figure from clay, and which in turn sort of relates to the Genesis creation story of Adam, which means red clay, being created by the divinity and so on. So there's you can trace, and also as well, it sort of led into, funny enough, it led in more recent history to the figure of Frankenstein's monster, which is a sort of science, flesh and blood robot, and the current idea of robots, and as you say, artificial intelligence. So there's a kind of you can trace the science fiction idea of the robot right back to the Old Testament Jehovah.
Well, this is where we get into territory that many people just they don't want to accept because they can't conceptualize of it. And because they can't conceptualize of it, therefore it can't happen. It's not happening. People don't do that kind of thing. I mean, you hear that all the time in different areas. And, with the transhumanist movement, particularly out of Silicon Valley, I mean, there's a huge crossover, and it has been since the 60s, between this notion of what is psychic development, what is psychic projection, what is technology, where do they interface and overlap, and is it possible to transfer consciousness into some kind of mechanical electronic structure because of the electronic nature of the brain. So they're very concerned about this. And why? Well, probably so they can have some variation of immortality. Can we transfer your brain? Can we transfer your consciousness? That kind of thing. And while that may sound outlandish to us or to your listeners, it doesn't mean it is to them. And that's the problem people get into. They keep judging things by their own standards, their own narrow limitations. And, the world doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it has a tendency to surprise us from time to time, doesn't it?
Well, it's scary to think that the people that are your would-be rulers, overlords, are not thinking like you. I mean, you want to, you think they're corrupt what have you, but to think that, and not all of them, but just enough of them may be thinking along those lines, it's too frightening. Because then what does that mean for the rest of us? Well, if they get robot bodies, what about the rest of us? Well, you're not in that equation. You see, and to think that, well, no, they wouldn't do that here. And I don't want to get off topic, but this is an egregore in itself, the egregore of denial. Well, what, you think that 80 million people were killed by communism, and that was a fluke? 15 million in the camps, and that was just a fluke? This is where the everything has its problem in the existential crisis of meaning and value and responsibility and what it means to be an individual. And those crises, that existential crisis, is what people answer through philosophical, religious, and political and occult practices and movements. And that's why those egregores are so powerful, because they offer a solution to that crisis of meaning.
Going back to Tulpas very quickly, one of the sections of the book that really struck me, and I think it kind of became a bit of a theme, which is where there are kind of tensions between groups and egregores. And I'm struggling to say the name of the is it Jorge Shugden?
Dorje Shugden.
Dorje Shugden. There we go. Apologise.
That sounded a bit like a Lovecraftian monster.
Yeah.
Oh, you never know at times. I
was just wondering if you could talk to that kind of part of the book, because I found that quite fascinating, this idea of a sort of runaway entity, I guess.
Well, that's a wonderful story because so many people get offended by it. Again, because people want to believe the stories around these entities that they have devotional practices for. They often, some of the most narrow-minded people I've met are Western converts to Tibetan Buddhism. And with that framework, because, when you've traded one religion for another, you're all in. You're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. And that's one of the problems of conversion. So with that said, the notion of the egregore, or excuse me, of the tulpa, is that it is a thought form or creation. Okay. The notion of Dorje Shugden is that it is a protector deity. And there's a whole series of stories around how he came to be a protector deity. A protector of what? Well, therein lies the problem. Within that framework, it's a protector deity within the framework of primarily, not just, within the Gelugpa sect of Tibetan Buddhism. And of course, what many Westerns don't want to understand is that there is a really difficult history in Tibet of some fairly violent sectarian conflict. And even that even lasted into the 30s. And, some people within the Gelugpa were okay with a Chinese, thinking they'd go home, a Chinese invasion of Tibet, as long as they kind of took care of the problem of the Nyingma and the Bon for them. It's not all, sweetness and light and bodhicitta. So, that's part of the narrative too. That's part of an egregore's narrative. Don't look behind the curtain. And I have tremendous respect for, Vajrayana, but I'm not going to pretend, for convenience where they're not making stuff up whole cloth or conveniently ignoring difficult facts. So Dorje Shugden is the protector of the Gelugpa sect. Well, that meant the protector against the other sects as well, and really the protector against anything else, anything else other than it, because that's what protectors do. And the question arose, and the Dalai Lama said, he practiced Dorje Shugden in his youth, and that he eventually abandoned it for various reasons. And there are certain groups in the United States and Europe and elsewhere that still continue this practice. And it's just, when you deal with that type of force or entity, strange things occur. And that's why he advocated giving it up, that it was not in the best interest of Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhists, to practice Dorje Shugden.
I think he said he had a series of dreams or something. Well, that's what he says, anyways. I don't know if they were convenient dreams, politically convenient dreams, or they were. I honestly don't know. I mean, it's not. Right. I can't possibly judge, but
no. But we listen to it and we take it under consideration for its time, And you would think that someone whose country's been invaded and they've been kicked out would kind of want all the protection and force they can muster. And that, this is basically saying, no, don't do it. It's not in our best interest to appease these entities because they get something in return. And the practices of them can be very difficult. That it's very similar to various pacts of goetic magic. There's agreements that are made, and those agreements have to be upheld on your end, or there's consequences. Which is very different from what many people think of as, the typical notion. So you rarely hear that notion of protector mentioned in outer tantras. It's always to my understanding, I think it's mostly in the inner tantras. Because it's tricky. It's tricky stuff. So these forces that come together and feed off the devotions of their practitioners, their followers, in exchange for certain perceived or actual benefits, is the whole nature and the embodiment of that practice. And any egregore for that matter.
Yeah. I mean, it was certainly unfamiliar to me, and one where, it's completely new territory to me, and so.
Well, I think it's interesting because one of the stories goes around Dorje Shugden being an executed prisoner, And of course, you see in a lot of practices the need for an executed criminal for the formation of an egregore. I don't know, one big one comes to mind. Can you think of it?
Yeah, like a certain Palestinian chapter somewhere in that part of the world. Yes.
Yeah. So, when we look at, Christianity, we have the execution of three criminals, and then, of course, the execution of the followers, which in theory, that force, that emotional offering, particularly the violence and death, then continues to feed the egregore, for better or worse.
Yeah. Also, you've got the notion, once practiced in some parts of the world, of a foundation sacrifice. Some, where build a bridge or a new bridge or building as a living sacrifice placed in its foundations. I mean, there's a theory, I don't know what you think about this, Mr. Stavish, but there's a theory that the third degree in Freemasonry had some kind of flavour of that to it, but, and there's also like animal sort of sacrifices or animals, like cats found in wars and, that kind of thing. That's we're sort of going in that kind of similar territory again, aren't we? We're sort of
sure, and of course, you see within Vajrayana Buddhism, just to clarify for the listener, they were quite horrified by a lot of the actual sacrifices, and therefore they moved to symbolic sacrifice. We see that notion in Christianity as well, where the mass becomes a symbolic sacrifice. Yeah. And of course, there's other various notions around it, but the fact is, you're not killing someone each time you hold the mass, even though it says, "Take this as my body and blood." So it's this notion of symbolic representation as a very vital and important medium or conduit, not as a yes, no, yeah, that's it, but it's not. It's a symbol. It doesn't really mean anything. No, the symbol is a very vital and powerful force and presence.
I was kind of interested. Obviously, you have your own take on egregores. Do you discourage people attempting to create their own egregores, or do you think, do you think that's not a good practice, as it were, or is it something you're against?
Everyone's going to make up their own mind. They have to assess their own capacity. If I tell you not to do it, people are going to run out and going to try it. But do they know what they're doing? If they know what they're doing, they don't need my advice. I think the issue is, first and foremost, take an assessment of the groups you're in and decide what groups are healthy for you and helpful for you, and then make decisions. If you may find that your life straightens out by just getting better distance from a lot of the groups that you're in, creating healthier relationships with the people and the ideals. Again, this all focuses around an unhealthy attachment to ideals when it's negative. The group is going to give my life meaning. Well, no, it can give it some meaning, but it can't give it meaning. You still have to find value and meaning in your own life in your own way. And we see that often in esotericism. People move to spirituality because essentially they've given up on achieving other goals in life. A friend of mine used to joke that almost all the ministers she knew were failed performers. And I think that's true in many ways. I see so many people in esotericism would really, they just want to be rock stars.
Yeah, that's true. And also as well, in the book you write quite a bit about Kenneth Grant and those particular sort of the Typhonian sort of currents and things, and how they draw upon Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and their work.
Well, that's just an amazing thing, because it thins the line between fantasy and reality at that point. Right here in terra firma, we don't have a lot of freedom of action. In our thoughts we do, but not in our action. Remember, freedom of action, because fire burns, water makes wet, wind blows, and gravity is your friend as long as you're not falling more than maybe 6 inches. After that, it starts to hurt. So the world has very reliable, the physical world is very reliable cause and effect. Or all of our material sciences is based around it. It's what allows us to have the wonderful technology and quality of life that we have. And that's what allows us to be speaking this way right now at this time. We don't even think about it. It's so predictable. But in the mental domain, in the imaginary domain, in the psychic domain, we slowly begin to acquire more freedom of action. And in theory, and this is where esotericism and psychic phenomena and psychic research comes in theory, increased freedom of action in the psychic domain will result in an increased freedom of action even in the material domain. Otherwise, well, what are, magical rituals and psychic research is worthless. Alchemy is just a giant experiment in psychokinesis when you get right down to it. So as we undertake these paths and practices, in theory, as we become more self-aware and decluttered internally, that we will acquire more self-knowledge, and with that will confer automatically virtue. And virtue isn't just some notion of a pleasant moralizing, but it is a true virility or power. In the classical teachings of theurgy, virtues and vices are very important. In Tibetan Buddhism and all the yogas, and the virtues and vices are very important. The problem arises is that as one gets further and further away from the herd of people, the mass, and on their path of individuation and individual awakening and awareness, one can begin to understand the outcomes of actions far in advance, and that's what allows for prophecy or prediction. But that also means that individuals can act in a manner that goes completely against the group norms, and it's not understood. So there you have that crazy yogi phenomena. See, I'm trying to show how all this interacts. Okay. And within that framework, then the individual, if they seek to create an egregore, the whole burden of that creation now is on them. It's not a freebie. Let me just be very clear on that. You can do it if you like, but there's costs accounted with everything we do.
Yeah, actions have consequences, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Before we're nearing the end of our interview, I just kind of want to speak to you about a large portion of your book is about how to sort of rid yourself or defend yourself against egregores, and I was wondering if we could talk to that.
Oh, sure, that's a great one, because in the book we focus a lot on the problems, and I need to be very clear on that. There's a lot of good egregores out there. If you're a drug addict or an alcoholic and you find yourself in the right AA meeting, I mean, that can be what pulls you out of the off the brink of the precipice of death and destruction. There are many people who, they found Jesus, and that saved them from a terrible life, terrible problems from the direction they were going in, or they found whatever, fill in the blank. So there are healthy egregores. You just want to make sure the one you're in is good for you, that it's fulfilling the promises. Now, if it's not, one of the ways to check how much influence it has on your life is kind of look around. Look around your apartment, look around your room, look around your house, and say, how much stuff here is kind of a representation of that egregore? And it can be anything. I mean, you could just be obsessed with, some movie stars or some rock band or something. And it's just your whole focus. It's your whole thing in life. Well, that's not good. You need a life of your own. So what you do is you take down all the pictures, take down all the posters, take down all the banners, take down all the books, and put everything associated with this thing you love so much, this group, this ideal. If it's an ideal, it could be a political ideal or a social ideal. And put them in boxes in your closet and don't look at it. And notice how much free space you have. And notice how much free space you have in your mind too. How that your mind is not automatically directed just through the stimulus response effect of those images or those sounds or those ideas around you. and just see how much freedom you have. And then if you like, you could slowly reintegrate some of those ideas back into your life, or you can decide if you want to move in a different direction. Now, if it's really terrible, you may have to burn those things. You may have to destroy them to get rid of the link. But I think for many people, it's not that severe. They just put it in the closet for a month, maybe more, maybe a month and a half. Give it a good stretch. And then they get to notice, wow, I really didn't miss that. Wow, I've really got more time. I'm not spending that much time on social media defending things that really don't concern me or I can't have any effect on. I'm not spending as much time watching those shows that I was so wrapped into as an extension of my fantasy life and my fantasy ideas. Now you have time to do other things and be truly creative in your own life, whether it's exercise, lose weight, learn how to knit wool caps, or, do something else. You now have time. And with that, you have the potentiality to create and recreate yourself in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
That makes you happy.
Because these psychological sort of landscapes are they're not moral or immoral. They're amoral. They reflect the values and beliefs that we approach them with. And it's in most cases, like you seem to be suggesting, is a case of negotiating the landscape.
Very, very much so. I mean, of course, there are some that are just terrible, and we don't need to focus on those. You kind of recognize them, and they're in the book. And there's some that are really good, but only for a time being, and then you have to leave. You have to learn to go stand on your own. So that's really what the book is about. The book is about, it's really a coming of age story, helping people to come of age and, stand on their own to negotiate their own inner psychic landscape in a healthy and productive way.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I wanted to bring up as well before you went is the foreword to your book is written by James Wasserman, who passed recently, and I was wondering if you could, because we didn't really cover James Wasserman's passing, and I assume you were familiar with him or friends with him in some form if he wrote the foreword to your book. And I was just wondering if you could speak to Mr. Wasserman a bit, and maybe what was your relationship with him?
Oh, James and I were simply friends. He was a wonderfully controversial figure, and we enjoyed that. And I believe it was around 2007. I'd have to check the year. I invited him, because I didn't know him. I invited him to come to northeastern Pennsylvania, to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, to speak at the Masonic Reading Society. And he was in New York at the time. And we arranged for him to come out, and we hosted the event at a very impressive venue, private business club in downtown, Westmoreland Club. It's just a wonderful interior, wonderful place. And he was suitably impressed. And at one point, I said, James, I have to go pick up my son from school. And we were in the car and we were talking. But before that, I also had him on the phone with some other people that he knew in common and had spoken with in probably decades. One of them was Joseph Leshevsky, who he knew from back in the day, probably the 70s and 80s when they were crossing paths with Israel Regardie and all of that. And he asked me, he said, are you you hadn't said it, but are you a member of the OTO? Because, of course, he has or had a fairly significant role in that organization. And I told him I wasn't. And he asked me, why not? And I said, well, because of the members. and he kind of laughed. And, when we took him to this place to give a presentation, he commented on how very different this was from the usual venues that he was often invited to. And we hit it off because we were willing to ask hard questions. He was a former hippie, and I was a former social worker. And, when you notice the collapse of that idealism, when idealism collapses and it goes toxic, it goes very toxic. And it goes really bad. And that's, one of the things I write about in other areas. When spiritual idealism goes toxic, it goes political. Okay, that's how it moves downward. And then it seeks to force its ideals through force, through coercion. And of course, James, within 5 years or 8 years of that, I know within at least 10, was having a lot of problems within the OTO because of his outspoken views. And a lot of the things he said, many people didn't like, but really they've been proven true. I've had a lot of experience in the media, quite a bit, and again, people are going to believe what they want to, regardless of the facts. That's the problem. It's when things are idealistically or ideally driven, you will consistently disregard physical reality right up until the end. And the end can mean a bullet behind your ear. So, he himself had moved from being this, very radical leftist hippie in the 60s and 70s, with all that implies in terms of various substance abuse and his having to overcome his own addictions, to becoming more pretty much a libertarian. I think that's how he identified himself, as a libertarian.
One of the things that struck me in the foreword is he talks about how that struggle, sort of tore him apart, or it wasn't something done lightly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was a very difficult time for him. Again, I was a former addictions counselor, and I've worked in a variety of settings in that area. So I've got a kind of a wide and varied background and experience with different people and groups. And, we hit it off, and he wanted to build more infrastructure for his organization. And again, I'm not a member of it. I never have been, and I never will be. I've gotten along well with a few people. James is one of them. Juan Duquette was another, and a few other folks who I like. But that said, what my support for him was primarily that he wanted to build something meaningful, something that would last. And, that's a discussion for another day. But I think you can see within that framework of that organization, within the last 5 years, 6 years, it's really been torn apart by a political litmus test, which he clearly failed. And that, and that litmus test is again, that egregore now saying, this is what it means to be. If you're going to be a good person, this is what you need to think and believe and do. So within that framework, you see a lot of moralizing, which coming out of the OTO is a high irony given the activities of its members back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah, I mean, I had the good fortune of meeting Mr. Wasserman on one occasion. It was a very memorable occasion. He was a scholar and a gentleman, so
always was, but he wouldn't take crap from anybody. I think that's what maybe offended folks. But with me, we were always very blunt and very funny, and I enjoyed his company and support, and I liked him a great deal, and I miss him a great deal.
That's a good place to end the interview. Thanks so much. If people want to sort of find you online, where should they look?
Well, if they just Google my name, a lot of things will come up, but I would say go to the Institute for Hermetic Studies, Google that, and you'll get our webpage, but also go to teachable.com, and Institute for Hermetic Studies at teachable.com. That's the best place. That's where our coursework is. And just sign up for Unfolding the Rose. It's 6 hours of coursework. It's at no cost to you, and you'll get a taste of what we have to offer. And I think you'll enjoy it.
Do you have any new books on the horizon? Or?
Oh, we do. In fact, coming out next year, I think it's Anathema Press. I hope so. I didn't mention the wrong publisher. Is going to be doing a gourmet edition of a 2-volume set called Order Out of Chaos, which is a series of, I gotta tell you, they were just spectacular. Really some spectacular essays that I wrote as part of a fundraising project for the Institute. And, you say that because sometimes you just get lucky. I think creative people out there understand this. Sometimes like with Egregores, I just sat down and it happened. I got lucky, and you cross your fingers and you say, thank you very much. Yeah. And, most of these essays are kind of like that. It's like, wow, that was good. I'm not going to, it's time to stop. It's time to stop. It's good. Don't overcook it.
Well, thank you again anyway. It was great to have you on, and we'll hopefully be speaking to you soon on your more recent book, the Path of Freemasonry.
Well, thank you very much. I look forward to it.
And we're back. That was a really interesting interview. What did you think?
Yes, he had a very clear idea of the content he wanted to bring to it, and that's, like I say, reflected also in the book itself.
Yeah, it's the book's very comprehensive, I'd say, isn't it? And I think I get the impression we could probably have kept recording for several hours, and got a very vast well of knowledge from Mr. Stavish.
Yeah, and he has a sort of, like I think you were saying, he has a kind of sort of very reflective sort of style of the discussion, guiding the discussion there. So.
Yeah, it was good. Okay, so yes, just a reminder again, we are running a competition until the end of January 2022. In case you're listening to this in, God knows how many years later, it's too late, it's gone. But yeah, to the end of January 2022, if you go to sittingnow.co.uk, you have to follow us on Instagram, follow the instructions on the post at sittingnow.co.uk for episode 60, the Tobias Churton episode. You'll see all the details there. But yeah, so far we've got one person that's I think it's because we hid the competition at the end of the episode. So I'm going to make a real point of hammering it home on this one because it's a good book, and one of you guys should claim it. And we'll select at random. I found some software where you can randomly select people's names from a list. So anyway. Yes, follow us on Instagram, Sitting Now. Basically, on social media, we're Sitting Now, one word, SITTINGNOW. And we will be back next week with returning guest Peter Gray and Alcestis Dimesh.